Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of those names you've probably heard since grade school, maybe written on a whiteboard by a tired history teacher who secretly wanted to talk about anything else. Yes, Alexander the Great. And yes, that's literally the title history gave him. Not Alexander the Okay, not Alexander the Mediocre, just straight up great, which honestly feels like overcompensating, but we'll let that slide for now. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, grab a cup of chamomile tea, unless you're one of those people who insists coffee helps them sleep, in which case, I don't know how your nervous system functions, but more power to you. We're going to drift slowly through the life of one of the most celebrated conquerors in history. And by celebrated, I mean a man who spent most of his short life stomping across the ancient world because sitting still was apparently too much of a challenge. A prince with mommy and daddy issues. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in a place called Pella, which was the capital of Macedon. Now, Macedon at the time wasn't exactly the shining beacon of civilization. The Greeks kind of looked down on them as these rough northern cousins, like the bumpkin relatives you don't really invite to the fancy Athenian symposium because they might drink all the wine before the philosophers even start talking. His dad was Philip II of Macedon, a man who basically turned Macedon into a regional powerhouse through equal parts clever politics, relentless warfare, and the kind of charisma that usually means this guy is bad news at family gatherings. Philip was not just ambitious, he was like ambition incarnate. He wanted Greece, he wanted Persia, he probably would have wanted the moon if anyone had invented telescopes yet. And then there was Alexander's mom, Olympias. She was from Epirus, a neighboring kingdom, and she was the kind of mother who really believed her child was destined for divine greatness, like genuinely convinced. According to tradition, she claimed that Alexander wasn't Philip's son at all, but rather the son of Zeus. Yes, the Zeus, king of the gods, notorious thunder thrower, professional philanderer. It's always Zeus, isn't it? The guy couldn't keep it together for 5 minutes without showing up as a swan, a bull, or a weird golden shower. And here Olympias is telling everyone her son is literally divine. No pressure, little Alex. So, on one side we've got Dad, who's building an empire and teaching his son to wield a sword before he can probably even hold a spoon, and on the other side we've got Mom, telling him he's a demigod. That's a recipe for someone who is definitely going to need a therapist, except therapists weren't really a thing in 356 BCE. Tutored by Aristotle, because why not? Now, Alexander wasn't just given a sword and told go nuts. His father wanted him educated. And when you're Philip II, you don't hire some random village school teacher. You hire Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the philosopher, scientist, and general know-it-all who basically wrote the user manual for ancient Greece. So picture this. Little Alexander sitting under a tree, probably fidgeting because what child doesn't, while Aristotle drones on about metaphysics, ethics, and biology. And somewhere in between philosophy lectures, Aristotle probably slips in something like, by the way, Persians are barbarians and you should totally go conquer them one day. Subtle. Alexander grew up absorbing a lot. He read Homer's Iliad so many times he basically memorized it. He admired Achilles, which is maybe not the healthiest role model since Achilles was famous for his anger issues and his inability to manage his death very gracefully, but hey, kids pick strange heroes. The horse that made him famous. There is a story every Alexander biography just has to tell, so let's get it over with now. It's the one about the horse. Alexander was about 12 when a horse named Bucephalus was brought to his father. The animal was huge, wild, and totally unmanageable. Basically, the horse version of don't even bother. Everyone gave up, except little Alexander. He noticed the horse was scared of its own shadow. So he calmly turned it toward the sun, hopped on, and just like that, instant friendship. He tamed it, rode it around, and impressed his dad so much that Philip allegedly said something like, "Son, you'll have to find a kingdom big enough for yourself, because Macedon isn't nearly large enough." Which, knowing Philip, was half pride and half, "Oh God, what have I unleashed?" Bucephalus became Alexander's lifelong horse, riding with him on campaigns until the horse eventually died in India. And yes, Alexander named a city after him, because when you're Alexander, you don't just cry about your pet, you immortalize it on the map. A family that could have used therapy. Let's take a moment to talk about Alexander's family dynamic. Philip was busy conquering Greece, collecting wives like they were trading cards, and being generally unfaithful. Olympias, meanwhile, was not exactly easygoing. She was deeply religious, had a snake cult thing going on, literally kept snakes in bed with her sometimes, and she hated Philip's other wives with a fiery passion. This created a wonderful, cozy, nurturing household where young Alexander got to watch his parents constantly feud. He was fiercely loyal to his mom, but he also admired his dad's military genius. This basically set up his lifelong conflict. He wanted to outdo Philip, but he also carried Olympias's conviction that he was destined for godhood. That's the kind of childhood cocktail that makes for either a great conqueror or a great disaster. Spoiler, he was kind of both. The hare steps up. So, fast forward a bit. Philip's busy preparing for a massive invasion of Persia, the big leagues. He's already got Greece mostly under his thumb. The Olympics are basically his personal bragging platform. Things are going great. Until he gets assassinated. Yep, Philip, after years of dodging battle wounds and surviving political enemies, gets killed in 336 BCE by one of his own bodyguards during a wedding feast. Weddings. Always fun, always dangerous in history. The motives are murky. It could have been personal, could have been political, could have been Olympias pulling strings, but either way, the throne is suddenly vacant. Enter 20-year-old Alexander. Barely out of his teenage years, but already with that divine destiny ringing in his ears, he seizes the moment, crushes some rebellious factions, and cements his rule almost overnight. And honestly, it's impressive. Most 20-year-olds today can't even decide what to do with their college major, and here's Alexander uniting Greece and planning a world conquest. Persia, here we come. From the very start, Alexander had one big target, Persia. You have to remember, Persia at this point was the giant of the ancient world. Huge empire, spanning from modern-day Turkey all the way to India, rich, powerful, intimidating. The Greeks had a complicated relationship with Persia, half fear, half resentment, sprinkled with grudges from those famous Persian wars. So Alexander basically picks up where his dad left off. In 334 BCE, he crosses into Asia Minor with around 40,000 men. Not exactly a massive force compared to Persia's resources, but Alexander's confidence could probably power a small city. He wins his first big battle at the Granicus River. Classic underdog story. Young king, small army, huge risk, and he pulls it off. His reputation starts to grow. Greatness with a side of ego. Here's the thing about Alexander. He wasn't just a good general. He was insanely charismatic. His men adored him because he shared their hardships. He marched alongside them, ate the same food, slept on the same ground. But he also had this ego, the size of his future empire. He wanted to not just conquer, but to be remembered. So everywhere he went, he started founding cities. And what did he name them? Alexandria. Lots and lots of Alexandrias. There are, depending on how you count, more than 20 ancient Alexandrias scattered across the map. It's like he was saying, yeah, sure, conquer the city, but don't forget who did it. humble wasn't really his vibe. Wrapping up tonight's drift. And that's where we'll pause for now. Alexander is in his early 20s, just getting started, and he's already carving his name across the ancient world. He's a mix of genius, narcissist, and maybe a little bit of mom's divine destiny storytelling lodged in his brain. In the next part, we'll keep floating through his campaigns, battles with Persia, his legendary showdown with Darius, and of course, all the drama of trying to rule the world before he even turned 33. So let's set it down gently here. You can close your eyes, let the thought of endless Alexandrias drift into the distance, and maybe wonder what kind of guy names an entire empire after himself before he's old enough to rent a car in modern terms. Hey again. If you're still awake after part 1, first of all, congratulations. You either have the stamina of an insomniac or the inability to find the pause button. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we're gliding deeper into the world of Alexander the Great. Our restless young king has just crossed into Asia Minor with his not-so-huge army, and he's about to take on the largest empire on Earth. Because, why not? Persia, Round 1, the Granicus River. So, let's set the scene. It's 334 BCE. Alexander has about 40,000 men. Persia has, well, more. A lot more. They've got resources, numbers, and the kind of imperial bureaucracy that means you can call in troops from basically everywhere between Turkey and India. But what Persia doesn't have is Alexander's sheer audacity. At the Granicus River, Alexander does what any level-headed commander would avoid. He charges straight across the river at the Persian forces, which is kind of like trying to start a fist fight while standing waist-deep in a swimming pool. Everyone thought this was a bad idea, but somehow he pulls it off. He nearly dies in the process. Legend says a Persian noble almost killed him before one of Alexander's men swooped in to save him. Still, he wins. Persia loses. And Alexander earns his reputation as the guy who always does the most dangerous, most dramatic thing possible, and somehow lives to brag about it. Asia Minor, Welcome Committee of Greek Cities. After Granicus, Alexander starts sweeping through Asia Minor, liberating, or, let's be real, conquering, Greek cities that had been under Persian control. He spends it as liberation because branding matters. To the Greeks, he's not just some Macedonian warlord anymore. He's the champion of Hellenic freedom. And people love a hero, even if he's also the guy taxing you afterward. Along the way, he grabs treasure, supplies, and more followers. It's like building momentum in a video game. Win a battle, loot the place, level up, repeat. Persia, Round 2, the Battle of Issus. Now here's where things get dramatic. Well, dramatic in a very slow bedtime way. In 333 BCE, Alexander meets King Darius III of Persia at the Battle of Issus. And Darius is not some random satrap or provincial governor. He's the king of kings, the guy who technically owns the entire empire. The battle itself takes place on a narrow coastal plain, which ironically works against Persia. Darius has numbers, but not enough space to actually use them effectively. Alexander, meanwhile, uses his favorite trick: charge hard, hit the weak spot, and personally lead the attack. Again, risky. Again, successful. At some point, Darius panics, abandons his army, and flees the battlefield. Imagine being the most powerful monarch in the known world and running off like you just remembered you left the oven on. Not a great look. Alexander captures Darius's family, his wife, mother, and daughters, and to his credit, he treats them respectfully. He doesn't kill them, doesn't abuse them, just keeps them comfortable while making sure Darius knows exactly who's holding his loved ones hostage. Psychological warfare, ancient style. Egypt, because why not add another country? After Issus, Alexander swings south. Persia's naval presence in the Mediterranean is still strong, so he decides to cut them off by taking control of the coast. This leads him into Egypt, which, at the time, was under Persian rule. Here's the funny part. The Egyptians basically welcome him with open arms. They were not big fans of Persian overlords, so when Alexander rolls in, they crown him pharaoh like it's no big deal. He gets treated like a god, literally, because Egypt had that habit with their rulers. And Alexander, of course, eats this up. Divine status? Yes, please. During his time in Egypt, he founds one of his most famous cities, Alexandria. Out of all the many, many Alexandrias he planted, this one actually becomes a huge cultural and intellectual hub for centuries. So, for once, the self-aggrandizing name stamp actually sticks. Oh, and he also takes a side trip to the Oracle of Ammon in Siwa. The oracle tells him he's the son of Zeus Ammon, which conveniently lines up with what his mom had been telling him his whole life. You can almost hear Olympias saying, "See, told you so." Now we get to the big showdown, 331 BCE, the Battle of Gaugamela. This is the moment where Alexander officially cements his legend. Darius, probably embarrassed from his previous disappearing act, gathers an enormous army. Some sources claim hundreds of thousands of troops, though ancient historians were not exactly known for accurate head counts. Let's just say it was way more than Alexander had. The Persians even prepare the battlefield, flattening the ground to give their war chariots the best chance. It's like setting up home field advantage. Alexander shows up with his smaller force, looks around, and basically says, "Yeah, I've got this." He uses brilliant tactics, exploiting gaps in the Persian lines, and once again personally leads a cavalry charge right at Darius. And once again, Darius flees. It's déjà vu, but with higher stakes. This time, Persia's fate is sealed. Alexander is now, for all intents and purposes, master of the Persian Empire. Marching into Babylon. After Gaugamela, Alexander enters Babylon in a grand procession. The city doesn't resist. It welcomes him like a celebrity on tour. He takes over the palaces, the treasury, the administration, everything. It's all his now. The kid from Macedon, who once impressed his dad by riding a horse, is suddenly ruling the greatest empire of the age. And here's the twist. He doesn't stop, because Alexander has this habit of thinking, what's the next horizon? Conquering Persia wasn't enough. He wants the world, or at least whatever part of the world people in 331 BCE knew existed. Playing King of Kings. Now, conquering is one thing. Ruling is another. Alexander starts adopting Persian customs, like wearing their robes and expecting people to perform proskynesis, bowing down and kissing the ground in his presence. This does not go over well with his Greek and Macedonian companions, who are very into their whole "we don't bow to anyone" identity. It's a classic case of cultural clash. Alexander sees himself as the unifier of East and West, blending traditions, creating something new. His men see him as getting a little too big for his divine boots. But Alexander is firm. He's not just the Macedonian king anymore. He's the King of Kings, which is great branding, but not so great for keeping your friends. Trouble among friends. Speaking of friends, Alexander's inner circle starts showing cracks. His lifelong buddy and general, Parmenion, is left behind in Persia and later accused of treason. Alexander has him executed, just like that, cold. His companions start realizing that being close to Alexander is a mix of perks and very real dangers. Even Clitus the Black, the man who once saved Alexander's life at Granicus, ends up on the wrong side of the king's temper. During a drunken quarrel, Alexander stabs him to death, which honestly is not a great way to treat the guy who literally stopped you from dying earlier in your career. But Alexander was impulsive, prideful, and maybe drinking way too much wine that night. He regretted it deeply afterwards, but regrets don't bring people back. Onward to the east. Still, despite drama at home base, the campaigns continue. Alexander marches further east, chasing what remains of Persian resistance. He captures Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, and, here comes another legendary story, burns it down. Some say it was revenge for Persia's earlier invasion of Greece. Some say it was drunken impulse. Either way, the glorious city went up in flames, and Alexander later claimed he regretted it, which is kind of like setting your neighbor's house on fire and then saying, "Whoops, my bad." But by this point, Alexander is unstoppable. Persia is his name is spreading everywhere, and he's still not satisfied. India beckons, and with it, even more glory, or more trouble, depending on how you look at it. Gently setting it down. So where does that leave us for tonight? Alexander has taken down the Persian Empire in a handful of years. He's in his 20s, standing at the pinnacle of power and already creating tension with his own men by demanding recognition as something more than mortal. It's impressive, it's reckless, and it's definitely not the behavior of someone who plans to retire quietly with a villa by the sea. Next time, we'll float further east, into India, with elephants, mutinous soldiers, and the growing weight of Alexander's own ambition. Because apparently, conquering the known world wasn't enough for this guy. So let your eyes drift, let the image of Babylon's grand gates fade, and remember, sometimes the greatest conquerors are also the loneliest, most restless souls. Welcome back, Night Owls. If you're still with me, it either means you're really into Alexander the Great, or you've given up on the idea of sleep entirely. Either way, here we are. Last time, we left Alexander at the height of his power, Persia conquered, Babylon under his control, and his ego expanding faster than his empire. Now, instead of kicking back and enjoying all those palaces, what does he do? He keeps going, eastward, because apparently conquering the world is a marathon, not a sprint. Why stop now? By the early 320s BCE, Alexander had already done the impossible. Persia was crushed, his enemies scattered, and he'd basically secured a legacy that would outlast him by millennia. Most people would have been satisfied at that point, but Alexander? No. He had Achilles syndrome. Remember, his childhood hero was a guy who sulked in a tent until he could rush into battle and die gloriously. So the idea of enough is enough wasn't really part of Alexander's vocabulary. He looked at the map and thought, what's on the other side of these mountains? Let's go find out. Spoiler, the answer is India, and also a whole lot of elephants. Bactria, not exactly a vacation spot. Before reaching India, Alexander had to deal with Bactria and Sogdiana, regions that today would be around Afghanistan and Central Asia. And let's just say this was not smooth sailing. The terrain was brutal, the locals weren't keen on being conquered, which, fair enough. Guerrilla warfare, constant uprisings, and rugged landscapes turned this into the most exhausting part of Alexander's campaign so far. He spent years putting down rebellions, marrying local princesses for political alliances, and planting yet more Alexandrias. Yes, because nothing screams lasting peace like slapping your name on a city in the middle of nowhere. This is also where he met Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman who became his first wife. The marriage was politically strategic, of course, but by most accounts, Alexander genuinely liked her. Which is sweet if you ignore the fact that she was essentially a symbol of his attempt to fuse Macedonian and local cultures, romance and empire building all in one package. Marching toward India. By 327 BCE, Alexander was ready for the next big move. He crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, again, not exactly a pleasant Sunday stroll, and entered the northwestern regions of India. This was unfamiliar territory for his men, different terrain, different climate, and of course, different enemies. At first, things went relatively smoothly. Some local rulers submitted to him, figuring it was better to hand over tribute than to get steamrolled. But then came one of the most famous battles of his entire career, the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Ah yes, 326 BCE. Alexander's encounter with King Porus at the Hydaspes River. This battle gets remembered for one reason. elephants. Porus commanded a force that included war elephants, huge, intimidating animals that the Macedonians had never faced before. Imagine being a soldier used to fighting cavalry and chariots, and suddenly you're staring down a wall of trumpeting elephants. Not exactly comforting. But Alexander, as usual, got creative. He crossed the river at night to surprise Porus and managed to outmaneuver the elephants. The fighting was brutal, mud, rain, and chaos, but eventually Alexander pulled off the win. Porus, badly wounded, was captured. And here comes one of those Alexander moments. Instead of humiliating him, Alexander asked him how he wanted to be treated. Porus, bleeding but proud, said, "Like a king." And Alexander, apparently impressed by the bravado, actually let him keep his kingdom as a subordinate ruler. Respect between conquerors. Almost wholesome if you squint hard enough. Elephants are cool, but the army is tired. The victory at the Hydaspes added another shiny trophy to Alexander's collection. But here's the thing. His army was done. These men had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and were now dealing with tropical rains, strange diseases, and endless promises of just one more campaign. At one point, Alexander tried to push further east toward the Ganges, but his men straight up refused. They mutinied at the Hyphasis River, saying, "Nope, we're not going another step." And honestly, can you blame them? They'd been on the road for nearly a decade, and the thought of facing even more kingdoms with even more elephants was not appealing. Alexander, furious but unable to change their minds, had to turn back. Imagine being the self-proclaimed son of Zeus, undefeated in battle, and getting stopped by your own exhausted soldiers. That had to sting. The miserable return journey. Turning back didn't exactly make life easier. Alexander decided to split his forces. Some went by sea, but others followed him through the Gedrosian Desert in modern-day Iran. And it was a disaster. Scorching heat, lack of water, and endless conditions killed thousands of his men. It was one of the worst moments of his entire campaign, and it wasn't even caused by an enemy, just the environment. Alexander, true to form, tried to share the suffering. There's a famous story of soldiers offering him a helmet full of precious water. Instead of drinking, he poured it on the ground in front of them, saying he wouldn't drink unless everyone could. Symbolic, dramatic, very on brand. But also, let's be honest, maybe a little frustrating if you were one of the dehydrated soldiers thinking, "Cool, thanks for wasting the water." Back in Persia, but changed. When Alexander finally made it back to Persia around 324 BCE, he was not the same young conqueror who had set out a decade earlier. He was more regal, more distant, and more obsessed with his image as a world ruler. He continued marrying off his officers to Persian women, blending cultures in ways that freaked out his Macedonian companions. He even started demanding divine honors, wanting to be worshipped not just as a king, but as a god. Some of his friends tolerated it, others grumbled, but nobody dared outright challenge him, because, well, he was Alexander the Great. A tragic reminder, Hephaestion. In the middle of all this, tragedy struck. In 324 BCE, Alexander's closest companion, Hephaestion, died suddenly, likely from a fever. Hephaestion wasn't just a friend, he was Alexander's confidant, maybe even more, depending on which ancient rumors you believe. Their bond was so strong that when Hephaestion died, Alexander was inconsolable. He grieved intensely, staging a massive funeral and demanding divine honors for his lost companion. This was the only time where Alexander, usually the unstoppable force, seemed human, vulnerable, devastated. It's one of those moments that cuts through the legend and reminds you he was still a young man, barely in his early 30s, dealing with loss while carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. So, let's pause here. Alexander has gone further than anyone imagined, fought elephants, faced mutinies, and returned home a different man. He's tired, his men are tired, and his empire's beginning to feel less like a triumph and more like an unmanageable sprawl. In our next drift, we'll float into the final chapter of his life, his sudden death at just 32, the chaos that followed, and the ironic truth that maybe conquering the world is easier than keeping it. For now, close your eyes, picture those elephants by the river, and remember, even the greatest conqueror in history couldn't convince a bunch of cranky, homesick soldiers to keep marching. Welcome back again. If you're still awake, I honestly don't know whether to congratulate you or send you a warm glass of milk. Either way, let's keep gliding. Last time, Alexander was trudging back from India, worn out, grieving, and increasingly acting like a man who thought he was more god than mortal. Now we arrive at the closing chapter. Spoiler, it's not exactly a peaceful retirement. A god in his own mind. By 324 BCE, Alexander was in Babylon, the glittering city he had made his unofficial capital. His empire stretched from Greece all the way to the edge of India, an expanse so large that it was more fantasy than practical governance. And Alexander knew it. He wasn't stupid. He realized that ruling such a monstrosity required more than brute force. It required an image. So he leaned hard into divinity. He demanded that people treat him like a god. Proskynesis, bowing and kissing the ground, was suddenly expected. He wanted sacrifices, temples, and statues. Basically, he was doing the ancient equivalent of demanding blue check marks everywhere. This didn't sit well with his Macedonian companions. These were men who grew up believing all citizens were at least somewhat equals. They didn't want to prostrate themselves before a guy they'd marched alongside for years, even if he did happen to own half the known world. But Alexander was stubborn. He wasn't just a Macedonian king anymore. He was trying to be the embodiment of East meeting West, the living bridge between cultures. Which is poetic, sure, but also pretty awkward when you're the one asked to kiss his sandals. Weddings, weddings, and more weddings. One of his grand experiments in blending cultures was the mass weddings at Susa in 324 BCE. Imagine the world's most awkward group wedding. Alexander ordered around 80 of his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He himself married 2 more wives, Statara and Parysatis, both connected to the old Persian royal family. Because why not? One wife in Bactria wasn't enough. Clearly he needed a collection. The men weren't thrilled. They went along with it because, well, Alexander wasn't the kind of guy you said no to. But once he died, most of them quietly divorced their new brides. So much for cultural fusion. The shadow of Hephaestion. All of this was happening under the shadow of Hephaestion's death. Alexander had loved him dearly, and losing him sent him into a spiral. He cut his hair in mourning, like Achilles did for Patroclus, and staged a funeral so grand it made entire cities bankrupt. He even asked the oracle at Siwa if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The answer was a polite no, but that didn't stop Alexander from trying to elevate his friend in every way possible. It's one of those rare glimpses into his actual heart. Conquerors rarely pause long enough to show grief, but Alexander wore his loss openly, which, depending on how cynical you are, was either deeply human or another theatrical attempt at self-mythologizing. Probably both. Plans, plans, and more plans. Even in his grief, Alexander wasn't slowing down. He began making plans for new campaigns, Arabia, maybe even farther west towards Carthage and Rome, because apparently conquering Persia and India wasn't enough. He needed one more world tour. He also started drawing up grand schemes, new cities, massive temples, economic reforms, harbors, roads. He had this vision of turning his empire into something enduring, something that could actually last. Whether he could have pulled it off? Well, history never gave him the chance. The sudden sickness. In June 323 BCE, Alexander was in Babylon, hosting feasts and planning expeditions. And then he got sick. Accounts vary. Some say it was a fever. Others suggest poisoning, though honestly that's probably ancient gossip more than fact. Malaria, typhoid, or some other nasty disease seem more likely. What's certain is that he went downhill fast. Over several days, he lost his strength, his voice, and eventually the ability to move. The once invincible young king was reduced to lying helpless while his generals filed past his bed, each one silently realizing their futures were about to get very messy. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great, age 32, was gone. 32. That's younger than most modern politicians are when they even get noticed. And yet by that age, he had redrawn the map of the ancient world. Who gets the empire? Here's the fun part. Alexander left no clear heir. Well, technically, he had a son, Alexander IV, born after his death, and possibly another illegitimate son floating around somewhere, but none of them were ready to rule. His half-brother, Arides, was mentally impaired, not exactly fit for leadership. So when his generals asked him who should succeed him, legend says his whispered answer was, "To the strongest," which, let's be real, is basically handing your empire a ticking time bomb. And it exploded, it did. His generals, known as the Diadochi, immediately began scheming, fighting, and carving up the empire like a particularly bloody pie. What Alexander built in a decade shattered within a generation. The empire without Alexander. The wars of the successors dragged on for decades. Eventually, the empire split into several Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, the Antigonids in Macedon. These states carried on bits and pieces of Alexander's dream, but never managed to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Ironically, Alexander's greatest legacy wasn't the empire itself, which fell apart almost instantly, but the cultural fusion he sparked. Greek language, art, and philosophy blended with Eastern traditions, creating the Hellenistic world, a world that would shape history for centuries. So even though his empire didn't last, the ripple effects did. The body that wouldn't decay. And then there's the mystery of his body. Supposedly, after his death, his corpse didn't decay for several days, which his followers took as proof of his divine nature. More likely, it was just good embalming, or maybe wishful thinking, but it certainly added to the legend. His generals squabbled over where his body should go. Eventually, Ptolemy grabbed it and brought it to Egypt, where it became a prized relic in Alexandria. People came from all over to gawk at the remains of the man who had once tried to conquer the world. Caesar himself supposedly visited the tomb centuries later. The irony of it all. So, here's the irony. Alexander conquered more territory than almost anyone in history, reshaped the ancient world, and inspired legends that would outlive him by millennia. But when it came to the one thing that really matters in monarchy, succession, he completely dropped the ball. No clear heir, no clear plan. His empire was a sandcastle, swept away by the tide the moment he was gone. In other words, he was brilliant at taking over other people's kingdoms, not so brilliant at keeping his own intact. A conqueror, yes. A builder of lasting dynasties, not so much. Drifting toward the end. So, here we leave him, Alexander the Great, the boy who thought the world was too small, the man who raced across continents, the king who wanted to be a god but couldn't even outrun a fever. He lived fast, died young, and left behind not an empire, but a legend. As you drift off tonight, picture him in Babylon, staring at maps, pointing east, dreaming of more conquests that would never happen. And then picture his generals immediately stabbing each other in the back over the spoils. 'Cause nothing says legacy like a giant family feud. So, Alexander is dead, 32 years old, gone just like that. And in true dramatic fashion, he left no clear heir, unless you count a baby who wasn't even born yet, and a half-brother who could barely tie his sandals without help. For an empire stretching from Greece to India, this was, let's say, less than ideal. And what happens when a king forgets to write a will? Everyone fights over the furniture. Except in this case, the furniture was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. Welcome to the Wars of the Successors, where Alexander's generals, the so-called Diadochi, spent the next 4 decades clawing, scheming, betraying, and occasionally pretending to be friends, all to get their hands on a slice of the empire pie. Spoiler, the empire doesn't survive. But oh, what a show! Meet the players. The main cast of this tragic-comic drama reads like the world's most dysfunctional friend group. Perdiccas, Alexander's right-hand man after his death, technically regent for the unborn baby, tries to keep things together. Spoiler, fails. Ptolemy, clever, cautious, and opportunistic, decides Egypt looks nice and quietly builds his own mini-empire there. Smart move. Seleucus starts off small, ends up ruling a massive chunk of Asia. The comeback kid. Antigonus the one-eyed, veteran general, terrifying, ambitious, missing an eye, but not an ounce of energy. Wants it all. Lysimachus occupies Thrace, modern Bulgaria-ish. Spends half his time fighting barbarians, the other half backstabbing the others. Cassander, son of one of Alexander's generals, sneaky, ruthless, and eventually controls Macedon. Not a fan favorite. This is the crew. If you're imagining a Game of Thrones map with everyone pointing daggers at each other, you're not wrong. The Baby Kings. Technically, Alexander's empire wasn't supposed to shatter right away. His generals announced that the throne would go jointly to Philip III, Arrhidaeus, Alexander's half-brother, mentally disabled; Alexander IV, the unborn son of Alexander and Roxana. A 2-for-1 monarchy. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. Because while these two sat around as symbolic figureheads, the real power fell to the generals, who immediately started grabbing territories like kids at a candy shop. The first betrayals. Perdiccas, acting as regent, tried to keep things together, but then Ptolemy, sly fox that he was, decided to snatch Alexander's body. Yep, the corpse. He hijacked the royal funeral procession and diverted it to Egypt because nothing says legitimacy like displaying a famous conqueror's mummified remains in your capital. This was both genius and insulting. Genius because it made Egypt the spiritual home of Alexander's memory. Insulting because, well, stealing corpses is a bad look, even in antiquity. Perdiccas was furious and marched on Egypt, but his campaign collapsed, his men mutinied, and he was assassinated in 321 BCE. One down, plenty more to go. Enter the bloodshed. Once Perdiccas was gone, the others smelled opportunity. Alliances formed and broke faster than you can blink. For the next 2 decades, the empire became a carousel of betrayals. Antigonus seized Asia Minor and acted like the boss. Seleucus clawed his way back to power after being chased out. Lysimachus held Thrace but kept meddling in Greece. Cassander took Macedon, imprisoned Alexander's widow Roxana, and later murdered both her and the young Alexander IV. Yes, he killed the kid. Empire building isn't pretty. At this point, the idea of keeping Alexander's dynasty alive was basically dead too. The boy king's murder ended any pretense of unity. Antigonus the Ambitious. If there was one man who came closest to reuniting the empire, it was Antigonus Monophthalmus, Antigonus the One-Eyed. Even though he was in his 60s, he charged across Asia, taking territories left and right. He even declared himself king, which basically forced the others to crown themselves as kings too. So much for shared rule. By the 310s BCE, the empire had morphed into a collection of rival monarchies, each pretending they were the real heirs of Alexander. The wars drag on. These wars weren't short little skirmishes. They dragged on for decades, exhausting everyone. Armies marched back and forth across Greece, Asia, and the Middle East. Cities were sacked, populations uprooted, and more than a few elephants got involved too. And yet, nobody could truly dominate. Whenever one general got too powerful, the others ganged up on him to take him down. It was like an endless, bloody balancing act. The Battle of Ipsus, 301 BCE. The climax came at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. On one side, Antigonus and his son Demetrius, nicknamed the Besieger for his love of giant siege engines. On the other, a coalition of the others, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy. It was a massive clash. Elephants thundered across the battlefield, cavalry swirled, and somewhere in the chaos, Antigonus, old, stubborn, still ambitious, was struck down and killed. His empire crumbled instantly. Demetrius survived, but spent the rest of his life bouncing around, trying and failing to live up to his father's dreams. And the dust settles. Sort of. After Ipsus, the map of the Hellenistic world stabilized, at least by ancient standards. Ptolemy got Egypt, rich and defensible, and built a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years, all the way to Cleopatra. Seleucus established the Seleucid Empire in Asia, stretching from Syria to Persia. Lysimachus held Thrace and bits of Anatolia until his own men turned on him. Cassander ruled Macedon and Greece, though his line didn't last long. In short, the empire was gone, but the pieces endured. The true legacy. So what do we take from this? Alexander built the greatest empire of his time, but it couldn't survive a single generation without him. His friends tore it apart, yet in doing so, they planted seeds. The kingdoms they created, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedonic, became centers of culture, trade, and learning. It wasn't the empire Alexander envisioned, but it was something, a chaotic, messy, fascinating something. The ironic ending. The best part is all these generals spent decades fighting, scheming, and killing each other for Alexander's throne, and yet none of them ever truly became Alexander. They were talented, sure, ruthless, definitely, but they were always shadows of their dead king. It's almost poetic. Alexander died at 32, leaving behind an empire that couldn't last. His friends spent the rest of their lives trying to wear his crown, and none of them ever really fit it. Time to drift. And with that, we can close our eyes to the sound of elephants charging at Ipsus, of generals whispering betrayal in smoky tents, of Alexander's empty throne sitting in Babylon, never filled again. The empire of Alexander may have crumbled, but the legends, well, they were just beginning. So, Alexander's empire is gone, torn to pieces, squabbled over, and fought into oblivion by the men who once swore loyalty to him. What remains? The scraps. But these scraps turn into something new, something lasting. The age of Hellenistic kingdoms. If the empire itself was a comet, bright, fast, and over in a flash, the kingdoms were the glowing trail it left behind, lingering for centuries. Each one claimed to carry Alexander's legacy, though in reality, they were mostly concerned with money, territory, and who got the best palace view. Let's meet the new rulers of the Mediterranean soap opera. Ptolemaic Egypt, Pharaohs with a Greek accent. First up, Ptolemy. Remember him? The clever one who stole Alexander's body like a prized souvenir? He settled in Egypt, and honestly, he hit the jackpot. Egypt was wealthy, stable, and fairly easy to defend thanks to deserts and the Nile. Ptolemy crowned himself pharaoh, but with a Greek twist. He and his descendants blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, ruling like pharaohs, worshipping the old gods, but also importing Greek art, language, and philosophy. And because no dynasty is complete without drama, the Ptolemies quickly became notorious for their family feuds. Siblings married siblings, children murdered parents, and the line eventually produced Cleopatra VII, yes, that Cleopatra, who would be the last of them before Rome swept in. But for now, in the 3rd century BCE, Ptolemaic Egypt was a powerhouse. Alexandria, the city, became the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean. It had the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders, and the library, the most ambitious knowledge project in antiquity. Think of it as an ancient Google, but prone to fires and bad record-keeping. The Seleucid Empire, too big to handle. Then we have Seleucus, who, against all odds, carved out the largest piece of the pie. His Seleucid Empire stretched from Syria to Persia, covering a mind-boggling amount of territory. On paper, it looked incredible. In practice, it was a nightmare. Trying to hold together Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, and everyone in between was complicated. The Seleucids spent much of their time putting out rebellions, dealing with ambitious satraps, and constantly losing bits of territory to whoever was nearby and hungry. Still, they had their moments. Seleucid kings loved founding cities, usually named Seleucia or Antioch or some combination of relatives' names. It was a branding strategy that would make Alexander proud. But the Seleucid Empire also became the most vulnerable. Sandwiched between Egypt to the west, restless Persians to the east, and rising Romans further west, they were destined to be chewed apart like a stale piece of bread. Antigonid Macedon, the home team. Meanwhile, back in Greece, the Antigonids emerged from the wreckage of Antigonus the One-Eyed's ambitions. His descendants eventually secured Macedon and parts of Greece, becoming the official home base of Alexander's legacy. But let's be honest, they weren't nearly as glamorous as Ptolemaic Egypt or as expansive as the Seleucids. The Antigonids mostly spent their time bickering with Greek city-states, dealing with Spartan uprisings, and watching nervously as Rome grew stronger. They were like the reliable but slightly boring branch of the family. Important, yes, but never quite center stage. The cultural mashup. Now here's the part that makes the Hellenistic world unique. Cultural fusion. Alexander may have failed to keep his empire united, but he succeeded in spreading Greek language, art, and ideas across the Near East. At the same time, Greek rulers adopted local customs. The result was a strange and fascinating blend. Greek temples in Egyptian style, Persian nobles reading Greek philosophy, and entire cities where you could find Zeus worshipped next door to Egyptian gods. This blending, called Hellenization, reshaped the ancient world. It wasn't always peaceful. In fact, it often wasn't. But it did create a shared culture that connected lands from Athens to Afghanistan. The everyday life angle. For ordinary people, life in the Hellenistic kingdoms wasn't all palaces and libraries. Taxes were high, armies marched through often, and kings changed faster than you could keep track of. But there were also opportunities. Trade flourished, cities grew, and if you were educated and Greek-speaking, you could find work almost anywhere. Imagine being a merchant in Alexandria, selling spices from India, papyrus from the Nile, and olive oil from Greece, all under one roof. The world was suddenly bigger, and for those awake enough to notice, it was dazzling. The shadow of Rome. Of course, there's an elephant in the room, and no, not the war elephants from earlier. I mean Rome. While the Hellenistic kings squabbled with each other, Rome was quietly expanding westward. At first, the Greeks barely noticed. Rome was just another power, one of many. But as the centuries ticked by, it became clear that Rome wasn't just another rival. It was the one that would eventually swallow them all. By the 2nd century BCE, the writing was on the wall. Macedon fell first, then the Seleucids, and finally Egypt, with Cleopatra as the tragic finale. Alexander's legacy refracted. So what do we make of all this? Alexander dreamed of a single empire. Instead, his generals carved out kingdoms that lasted longer than his own conquest. They weren't united, but they carried pieces of his vision, spreading Greek culture, blending East and West, and creating a world more interconnected than ever before. It's ironic, really. Alexander wanted glory for himself. What he left behind was a cultural legacy carried on by people who killed each other over his inheritance. He got the fame, but they did the legwork of making it last. Time to drift. And that's where we'll pause tonight. 3 kingdoms, each claiming the mantle of Alexander, each flawed in their special way. Egypt with its inbred pharaohs, Seleucia with its oversized empire, and Macedon with its stubborn pride. None of them would last forever, but together they kept Alexander's ghost alive for centuries after he was gone. So, close your eyes. Picture the lighthouse of Alexandria shining in the dark. Imagine the dusty streets of Babylon filled with Greek chatter. Think of kings arguing over who deserved to be called successor. And let yourself drift. Because tomorrow, Rome will come knocking, and history's stage will change again. So, the dust has settled on Alexander's empire. His generals carved it up, their children squabbled over it, and somehow, out of the chaos, 3 big players survived. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedon. For a while, these kingdoms strutted around like they owned the place. And in fairness, they did. Palaces, libraries, armies with elephants, they had the trappings of greatness. But history is cruel, because while they were busy stabbing each other in the back, another power was rising quietly in the West. That power was Rome. And Rome was about to turn the Hellenistic world into a playground, then a graveyard. Rome and Greece, a complicated relationship. Rome didn't start out gunning for Alexander's legacy. At first, they were just a scrappy city-state fighting their way through Italy. But by the 3rd century BCE, they'd become the Mediterranean's most irritating neighbor. When Rome finally tangled with the Greeks, it wasn't even over Alexander's empire. It was over Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Hellenistic king who decided to help the Greeks in southern Italy against Rome. Spoiler, it didn't go well. Pyrrhus won some battles, but at such a cost that we still call them Pyrrhic victories today. He slunk back to Greece, Rome shrugged, and history moved on. But the seed was planted. Rome and the Hellenistic kingdoms were now in the same orbit, and it was only a matter of time before someone made a move. Macedon falls, the first domino. The Antigonids in Macedon were the first to clash with Rome. They still imagined themselves as heirs of Alexander, lords of Greece, but honestly, they were past their prime. In the Macedonian Wars 214 to 148 BCE, Rome slowly dismantled them. At first, it was a tug of war. Rome beat King Philip V, then his son Perseus tried again, and, no surprise, also lost. By 68 BCE, Rome crushed the Macedonian army at the Battle of Pydna, and just like that, Macedon was done. Greece, the cradle of Alexander's world, was reduced to a Roman province. The home team was officially out of the tournament. The Seleucid struggle. Too much empire, not enough glue. Meanwhile, the Seleucid Empire was still pretending to be a superpower. But by the 2nd century BCE, they were stretched too thin. Eastern provinces slipped away, local rulers asserted independence, and the Seleucids kept shrinking like a wool tunic in hot water. Finally, Rome stepped in during the Roman-Seleucid War 192 to 188 BCE. King Antiochus III, called the Great, though maybe a bit optimistically, tried to push west into Greece. Rome said no, marched in, and at the Battle of Magnesia absolutely wrecked him. The Seleucids survived the defeat, but they were never the same. By the time the 1st century BCE rolled around, their empire had crumbled into pieces, with Rome picking up the scraps. What had once been Alexander's grand eastern inheritance became just another Roman frontier. Egypt, the last to go. And then there was Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt was rich, exotic, and very good at bribing Rome to stay away. For a while, it worked. Egyptian grain fed Rome's people, Egyptian gold greased Roman politics, and as long as the Nile kept flowing, Egypt was tolerated as a semi-independent client kingdom. But by the 1st century BCE, the dynasty had rotted from the inside. Inbreeding, assassinations, and family soap operas turned the Ptolemaic court into a tragic parody of royalty. Brother married sister, sister murdered brother, mother plotted against children. You name it, they did it. And then came Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra. Clever, charismatic, and the last gasp of Alexander's legacy. She tried to play Rome's power game, first with Julius Caesar, then with Antony Actium. It almost worked. Almost. But after the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, marched in. Cleopatra and Antony died in suitably dramatic fashion, Egypt fell, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Rome had officially swallowed the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Alexander's empire, reduced to a memory. And so, by the dawn of the Roman Empire, Alexander's once mighty dominion was gone. Every piece of it, Macedon, the Seleucid lands, Egypt, was now a Roman province. What's funny is that Rome respected Alexander. Generals like Julius Caesar and later Augustus saw him as a role model. Caesar famously cried at a statue of Alexander, saying he hadn't achieved half as much by the same age. Talk about unrealistic standards. In a way, Alexander's dream didn't die. It just got absorbed. Rome took the infrastructure, the cities, the cultural fusion, and ran with it. The Hellenistic world lived inside Rome like a ghost haunting its conqueror. The long legacy. Let's zoom out for a moment. Alexander died in 323 BCE. By 30 BCE, less than 300 years later, everything he built was Roman. That's not a long time, historically speaking. And yet, his influence stretched far beyond that. Greek culture, thanks to his conquests, had seeped into every corner of the Mediterranean and Near East. Rome itself became deeply Hellenized in art, philosophy, even religion. Without Alexander, Rome might have looked very different. So yes, his empire didn't last, but his legacy did, in ways he couldn't have imagined. A sleepy closing thought. Picture it, the grand tomb of Alexander sitting in Alexandria, while Roman emperors bow before it. The man himself, long dead, but his name still whispered in palaces and army camps centuries later. Not bad for a guy who never made it past 32. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Alexander's world absorbed into Rome. His kingdoms erased, but his influence immortal. So, Alexander the Great, dead at 32. His empire shattered, his successors bickering, his kingdoms gobbled up by Rome. By now you might think the story ends here, neatly tucked away under a dusty marble tomb. But no, Alexander doesn't vanish, he lingers. Not in body. His corpse disappeared at some point in antiquity, because of course it did, but in memory. For centuries, people couldn't stop talking about him, admiring him, copying him, even inventing new stories about him. This is the part where Alexander becomes less of a man and more of a myth. The spread of Greek language. One of the biggest consequences of his conquests was language. Alexander didn't just spread soldiers and cities, he spread Greek. Koine Greek, the common form, became the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Traders, scholars, even bureaucrats used it, whether they were in Egypt, Syria, or Asia Minor. It was the English of its day, not always loved, but definitely useful. And this mattered later. When early Christians wrote the New Testament, they chose Greek. Why? Because thanks to Alexander, Greek was the language almost everyone could understand. So, in a weird way, his empire helped shape the spread of Christianity centuries later. Not bad for a guy who mostly wanted statues of himself everywhere. Cities that lived on. Then there were the cities. Alexander founded more than 20 of them, and yes, most were called Alexandria. Subtle branding wasn't really his thing. Some of those cities fizzled out. Others thrived for centuries. The biggest success was Alexandria in Egypt, which became one of the most important cities of the ancient world. It had the library, the lighthouse, and a population that mixed Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and everyone else in between. Imagine a port where Indian spices, African ivory, and Greek philosophers all rubbed shoulders. That was Alexandria. The city outlasted its founder by nearly 1,000 years, which is more than you can say for most conquerors. The Library of Alexandria. Knowledge as a flex. Speaking of Alexandria, we can't skip the library. Supposedly, the Ptolemies wanted to collect every book in the world. Ships docking in the harbor were searched for manuscripts, which were copied and added to the shelves. It became the closest thing antiquity had to a universal archive. Philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists studied there. Names like Euclid, Archimedes, and Eratosthenes all passed through its orbit. Of course, the library also became famous for its destruction, or to be more accurate, its repeated destructions. Fires, neglect, wars, nobody can quite agree when or how it truly vanished. But the dream behind it, that was very Alexander. A little hubristic, wildly ambitious, and aimed at conquering the world in a different way, through knowledge. The Alexander Romance, fan fiction before fan fiction. Here's where it gets fun. By late antiquity, Alexander's story had turned into legendary fan fiction. The so-called Alexander Romance, a collection of told tales, spread across cultures. In these stories, Alexander wasn't just a king, he was a mythical adventurer. He fought sea monsters, traveled to the ends of the earth, even flew through the sky in a chariot pulled by griffins. Historical accuracy? 0. Entertainment value? Maximum. The romance was translated into dozens of languages: Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopian. Every culture twisted Alexander into their own hero. Sometimes he was a noble seeker of wisdom. Sometimes he was arrogant and punished by the gods. He became whatever people needed him to be. Alexander in the Middle East. In the Islamic world, Alexander appears in the Quran under the name Zulqarnain, the two-horned one. Scholars debated whether this really meant Alexander, but medieval writers often pictured him that way, complete with little ram horns. In Persian traditions, he was remembered as both destroyer and world-bringer. He burned Persepolis, yes, but he also connected East and West. Iranian poets centuries later still wrote about him, often ambivalently, as both conqueror and cultural bridge. Alexander in the West. Meanwhile, in Europe, Alexander was the ultimate role model for ambitious rulers. Medieval kings read about him and sighed, wishing they too could conquer the world by age 30. Julius Caesar famously wept when he saw a statue of Alexander, realizing he hadn't achieved nearly as much by the same age. Napoleon compared himself to him. Even modern generals couldn't resist the comparison. Basically, if you wanted to look impressive, you dropped Alexander's name. The art of being remembered. Alexander also changed art. Coins from his reign showed him with divine features, flowing hair, confident gaze, often with Zeusy touches. Later kings copied this style. He set the template for how rulers presented themselves, not just as leaders, but as semi-divine figures. Statues of him popped up everywhere, each more flattering than the last. Even centuries later, Roman emperors still borrowed his look. The boyish face, the heroic pose, it was the political Photoshop of the ancient world. The myth outlasts the man. And here's the irony. Alexander himself might have been impatient, reckless, and often cruel. His empire collapsed almost immediately after his death, but his myth endured. People remembered not the messy politics, but the idea of a young conqueror who reshaped the world. His failures faded, his legends grew. He became timeless, even when his empire wasn't. A sleepy reflection. So let's close our eyes on this image. A young man, long gone, but still haunting libraries, palaces, and legends. His armies disbanded, his cities scattered, his body lost, yet his name forever echoing. Not because his empire lasted, it didn't, but because the stories did. And in the end, maybe that's the only kind of immortality humans ever get. Hey guys, if you're still with me, congratulations! You've basically marched from Macedonia to India without leaving your pillow. Now we've reached the final stretch, where Alexander's battles fade into memory, and we're left with the softer question, why do people still care? Because, let's be honest, lots of kings and conquerors existed. Most are now forgotten footnotes. Nobody's binge listening to the full saga of, say, Antigonus Monothelmus before bed. Yet Alexander, he sticks. Like glitter, or that one weird song lyric you can't shake. Let's unpack why. The drama of dying young. Part of it is timing. Alexander died at 32, too young to fade, old enough to have achieved absurd things. He never had time to grow old, fat, and boring. No awkward post-conquest era where he stuck with tax reforms and palace renovations. He froze in memory as eternally young, eternally ambitious. Like James Dean, but with elephants and sarissas. Would we remember him the same if he had lived to 70, grumbling about arthritis in Babylon? Probably not. His early death left the story unfinished, and unfinished stories always linger. The aesthetic of the Golden Boy. Then there's the image. Statues, coins, mosaics, all showed Alexander as this handsome, slightly dreamy youth. Big hair, soft jaw, godlike stare. Ancient propaganda at its finest. Did he really look that good? Sources disagree. One historian says he had a ruddy complexion and a weird neck tilt. But the image of Alexander the Beautiful stuck anyway. Even centuries later, Roman emperors styled their busts to echo his vibe. It's the same trick modern celebrities use. Polish the image until reality doesn't matter. He became the brand of eternal youth and conquest. The conqueror's fantasy. But let's not kid ourselves. People also love Alexander because he embodies the ultimate conqueror fantasy. One man takes a small kingdom, then steamrolls the mightiest empire of his day. Persia falls, Egypt bows, India trembles. He doesn't just win battles, he changes maps. For later rulers, generals, and anyone with a fragile ego, this was catnip. Caesar cried at his statue. Napoleon couldn't stop name-dropping him. Even Hitler had Alexander biographies on his shelf, which says less about Alexander and more about insecure men with grand ambitions. Alexander became shorthand for ultimate victory. Whether or not he held it all together didn't matter. What counted was the sheer audacity of the attempt. The strange appeal of flaws. Yet part of his charm is also the flaws. He wasn't some flawless demigod. He drank too much. He flew into rages. He killed friends in fits of paranoia. He made impulsive decisions, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous. In short, he was human, and that makes him oddly relatable. You don't get the sense of a perfect saint or a robot general. You get a messy, emotional young man who just happened to wield world-changing power. That tension, genius mixed with chaos, keeps the story alive. Cultural crossroads. Then there's another reason we still talk about him, the cultural impact. Alexander smashed worlds together. Greek ideas blended with Persian traditions, Egyptian religion, Indian influences. His empire was less about lines on a map and more about connections. Trade routes expanded, philosophies met, languages merged. This is why historians call it the Hellenistic age. Not just Greek, but Greek-ish, with local twists. Imagine a world where statues of Zeus stand next to temples of Isis, and philosophers debate alongside astrologers from Babylon. That's the legacy. So even though his empire collapsed politically, the cultural fusion lasted. And in many ways, we're still living in that blended world. The eternal what if. Then there's the great question, what if he had lived longer? Would he have invaded Rome, marched into Arabia, Reached China? Built an empire that truly lasted? We'll never know, which is exactly the point. The unfinished story leaves room for speculation. Historians, novelists, even filmmakers keep filling in the blanks because an open-ended life is like a puzzle you can't stop tinkering with. And that makes Alexander a perpetual thought experiment. He becomes less of a man, more of a mirror for what we imagined could have been. Myth versus reality. Here's the thing, though. Half of what people know about Alexander isn't true. The Alexander romance, with its flying chariots and sea monsters, is pure legend. Medieval stories painted him as a knight before knighthood even existed. Different cultures turned him into whatever hero or villain they wanted. The historical Alexander was probably grittier, sweatier, and more flawed than the polished legend. But does that matter? Not really. For most people, the myth is the memory. The lines blur until he's both man and myth, conqueror and fairy tale. The bedtime angle. So why does Alexander's story make such good bedtime history? Because it's vast but oddly soothing. The details pile up, battles, cities, marriages, but the overall arc is simple. A young man rises fast, conquers everything, and dies too soon. It's tragic, but in a muted, inevitable way. And the humor helps. The drunken brawls, the over-the-top self-image, the awkward family drama. It softens the edges, makes the history human, almost cozy. Alexander becomes less of a distant marble figure and more like that chaotic friend who does everything too quickly and too dramatically, then leaves everyone else to clean up. Except in his case, the mess was half of Eurasia. The long echo. In the end, what we're left with is an echo. His cities may crumble, his empire may vanish, his body may be lost, but his story lingers, retold, reimagined, reshaped, century after century. Every time a ruler dreams of global conquest, Alexander is there. Every time cultures blend, his shadow flickers. Every time someone wants to tell a grand story about ambition and downfall, his name surfaces. Not because he lasted, but because he didn't. His brevity made him immortal. A gentle closing. So tonight, as you drift off, picture this. A young king, restless and glowing, marching across deserts and mountains. He doesn't stop. He doesn't pause. He doesn't age. He just keeps moving, always toward the horizon, always chasing something bigger. And yet, in the end, he's just a story, a long, winding tale we tell to ourselves, half history, half dream. Maybe that's all legacy really is. Not marble statues, not empires, just stories, whispered in the dark, helping strangers fall asleep thousands of years later. And on that note, good night, Alexander, and good night to you. Hey guys, if you're still with me, congratulations! You've basically marched from Macedonia to India without leaving your pillow. Now we've reached the final stretch, where Alexander's battles fade into memory, and we're left with the softer question, why do people still care? Because, let's be honest, lots of kings and conquerors existed. Most are now forgotten footnotes. Nobody's binge listening to the full saga of, say, Antigonus Monothelmus before bed. Yet Alexander, he sticks. Like glitter, or that one weird song lyric you can't shake. Let's unpack why. The drama of dying young. Part of it is timing. Alexander died at 32, too young to fade, old enough to have achieved absurd things. He never had time to grow old, fat, and boring. No awkward post-conquest era where he stuck with tax reforms and palace renovations. He froze in memory as eternally young, eternally ambitious. Like James Dean, but with elephants and sarissas. Would we remember him the same if he had lived to 70, grumbling about arthritis in Babylon? Probably not. His early death left the story unfinished, and unfinished stories always linger. The aesthetic of the Golden Boy. Then there's the image. Statues, coins, mosaics, all showed Alexander as this handsome, slightly dreamy youth. Big hair, soft jaw, godlike stare. Ancient propaganda at its finest. Did he really look that good? Sources disagree. One historian says he had a ruddy complexion and a weird neck tilt. But the image of Alexander the Beautiful stuck anyway. Even centuries later, Roman emperors styled their busts to echo his vibe. It's the same trick modern celebrities use. Polish the image until reality doesn't matter. He became the brand of eternal youth and conquest. The conqueror's fantasy. But let's not kid ourselves. People also love Alexander because he embodies the ultimate conqueror fantasy. One man takes a small kingdom, then steamrolls the mightiest empire of his day. Persia falls, Egypt bows, India trembles. He doesn't just win battles, he changes maps. For later rulers, generals, and anyone with a fragile ego, this was catnip. Caesar cried at his statue. Napoleon couldn't stop name-dropping him. Even Hitler had Alexander biographies on his shelf, which says less about Alexander and more about insecure men with grand ambitions. Alexander became shorthand for ultimate victory. Whether or not he held it all together didn't matter. What counted was the sheer audacity of the attempt. The strange appeal of flaws. Yet part of his charm is also the flaws. He wasn't some flawless demigod. He drank too much. He flew into rages. He killed friends in fits of paranoia. He made impulsive decisions, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous. In short, he was human, and that makes him oddly relatable. You don't get the sense of a perfect saint or a robot general. You get a messy, emotional young man who just happened to wield world-changing power. That tension, genius mixed with chaos, keeps the story alive. Cultural crossroads. Then there's another reason we still talk about him, the cultural impact. Alexander smashed worlds together. Greek ideas blended with Persian traditions, Egyptian religion, Indian influences. His empire was less about lines on a map and more about connections. Trade routes expanded, philosophies met, languages merged. This is why historians call it the Hellenistic Age. Not just Greek, but Greek-ish, with local twists. Imagine a world where statues of Zeus stand next to temples of Isis, and philosophers debate alongside astrologers from Babylon. That's the legacy. So even though his empire collapsed politically, the cultural fusion lasted. And in many ways, we're still living in that blended world. The eternal what if. Then there's the great question, what if he had lived longer? Would he have invaded Rome, marched into Arabia, reached China, built an empire that truly lasted? We'll never know, which is exactly the point. The unfinished story leaves room for speculation. Historians, novelists, even filmmakers keep filling in the blanks because an open-ended life is like a puzzle you can't stop tinkering with. And that makes Alexander a perpetual thought experiment. He becomes less of a man, more of a mirror for what we imagine could have been. Myth versus reality. Here's the thing, though. Half of what people know about Alexander isn't true. The Alexander romance, with its flying chariots and sea monsters, is pure legend. Medieval stories painted him as a knight before knighthood even existed. Different cultures turned him into whatever hero or villain they wanted. The historical Alexander was probably grittier, sweatier, and more flawed than the polished legend. But does that matter? Not really. For most people, the myth is the memory. The lines blur until he's both ma'am and myth, conqueror and fairy tale. The bedtime angle. So why does Alexander's story make such good bedtime history? Because it's vast but oddly soothing. The details pile up, battles, cities, marriages, but the overall arc is simple. A young man rises fast, conquers everything, and dies too soon. It's tragic, but in a muted, inevitable way. And the humor helps. The drunken brawls, the over-the-top self-image, the awkward family drama. It softens the edges, makes the history human, almost cozy. Alexander becomes less of a distant marble figure and more like that chaotic friend who does everything too quickly and too dramatically, then leaves everyone else to clean up. Except in his case, the mess was half of Eurasia. The long echo. In the end, what we're left with is an echo. His cities may crumble, his empire may vanish, his body may be lost, but his story lingers, retold, reimagined, reshaped, century after century. Every time a ruler dreams of global conquest, Alexander is there. Every time cultures blend, his shadow flickers. Every time someone wants to tell a grand story about ambition and downfall, his name surfaces. Not because he lasted, but because he didn't. His brevity made him immortal. A gentle closing. So tonight, as you drift off, picture this. A young king, restless and glowing, marching across deserts and mountains. He doesn't stop. He doesn't pause. He doesn't age. He just keeps moving, always toward the horizon, always chasing something bigger. And yet, in the end, he's just a story. A long, winding tale we tell to ourselves. Half history, half dream. Maybe that's all legacy really is. Not marble statues, not empires. Just stories, whispered in the dark, helping strangers fall asleep thousands of years later. And on that note, good night, Alexander, and good night to you.